that there was, I'd been suggesting to you in my previous remarks that there was a particular conundrum, if I may use that word, that the leaders had to think through. So if you turn your attention to this map, I'm going to show you a couple of maps over here. So this is what the map you're seeing here is a map of South Asia after the partition. Okay, after the partition. Partition meaning, of course, vivisection, division. Right? I also want to say one thing as a little footnote. For those of you who are interested in comparative histories, interested in colonialism, it has been argued by many people that the partition was, and I myself have argued that, but I think we need to put a nuance on it, that the partition was a favorite strategy of the British, wherever they went, whichever part of the world they colonized. We can think very quickly, in rapid succession, of a number of places that the British partitioned, including Ireland. And you know that the troubles in Ireland go back to 1920, 1922, the partition of Ireland. So you've got the Republic of Ireland. So Ireland is comprised of 32 counties, and then the 26 counties in the south are today what is called the Republic of Ireland. Right? And these are predominantly Catholic. And then the 6 counties of the top of Ireland, that's what's known as Northern Ireland. And you know that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It's not part of Ireland. It's part of the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And that was something that the British did because the northern counties were Protestant. They were much wealthier. Right? So there was a divide there, a Protestant-Catholic divide, a rich-poor divide. But the circumstances of that are quite different than the circumstances here. Another place which they partitioned was Cyprus, Palestine. Now, all of these places were ruled by the British. And in each of these cases, this is the solution that was effected. But each of these is also distinct. So you can use partition as a comparative trope, but it was also distinct. So what was the problem that I was describing to you? The problem was, if you recall how I set it up, that now we're in the mid-1940s, the end of the war. Okay, India is going to be given its independence. The question is, what shape is it going to take? What about the Muslims in India? Some of the Muslims have now come to demand a separate nation state. Right? And I'm not going to go over once again the logic of that demand, because I did that quite adequately in my previous lecture. But then you had these princely states. So you're seeing here a very rough map. It's not showing you all the princely states. Why is it showing you Hyderabad? Because Hyderabad was one of these 500 plus native or princely states as they were known. What was going to happen to these? Right? Long history, which doesn't really concern us very much as far as Gandhi is in the picture, but just so that you have an idea, at the time of the partition, each of these native states was given a choice. Just before the partition, they were given 3 options. They could sign a treaty whereby they agreed to be absorbed within India, within the India that was going to emerge. They could sign a treaty whereby they relinquished all their rights and agreed to be absorbed into Pakistan. Option number 2. Of course, is this a viable option for, let's say, a state such as Hyderabad? Theoretically, right? If this is going to be, so this is what became Pakistan, right? Because the majority of the Muslims were either on the western side or they were on the eastern side. And we're going to get to this in just a moment. But what about, let's say, a place like Hyderabad? Or what about another kingdom such as Lucknow over here, which had a very large Muslim population, right? How are they going to be part of Pakistan? I mean, what would be the mechanics of such a nation state fragmented itself into 10 different parts? Right? So it was not really a viable option for Hyderabad to be absorbed into Pakistan. The third option given to each country was it could try to declare its independence. Right? But then, of course, there would be problems. Would India permit that? And of course, all of these would become landlocked states, no access to the sea. We know that historically there's always a problem many times with landlocked states. And Hyderabad's a big state. But there were states in Gujarat, such as the one that Gandhi was born in, which were very, very small. Very, very small. I mean, you're talking about states the size of, something a little bigger than the UCLA campus. The smallest one would be, well, a little bit more than that, but not much more. Right? So those are the three options. In virtually all of these cases, there were a few trouble spots, but virtually, and that's one of those trouble spots is Kashmir. The problem still continues down to the present day. But in 99.9% of these cases, the states were absorbed into either India or Pakistan, in almost every case into India. All right? Now, let's go back to this and then show you a couple of the other maps. So you've got a large number of Muslims over here as well. And then you've got a large number of Muslims over there. So if you're going to create a nation state called Pakistan, and that's what happened, that nation state itself had two halves. Okay? And the two halves are between, are on either end of India. A situation wholly unprecedented in history, frankly, if you think about it, right? I mean, the only thing you think of, but that's quite different, is something like Alaska not being part of the continental United States. But it's not like, but it's not as though Alaska is surrounded by enemies, you know, if I may put it this way, okay? Right? We're not talking about the partition of the United States. We're talking about a territory that's acquired later on. Right? So the situation there is rather different and cannot serve as a comparison. And in that sense, the situation I'm describing is wholly unprecedented. I very often like to state that, think about the irony of creating a nation state here, such as Pakistan, where the country that is marked as the other, as your enemy, is India, and for 3 generations, every schoolgirl and schoolboy in Pakistan, down to the present day, well, not down to the present day, I should say, down to 1971, because in 1971 we're going to see what happened to this part of Pakistan, all right? But in the imagination of many Pakistanis, it's down to the present day. But strictly speaking, 1971, until 1971, every schoolboy or schoolgirl who had to draw a map of their country would first have to draw a map of India, right? The very country that you wanted to break away from. Because if somebody, if your assignment in school, you know, 5th grade geography, right, was, okay, kids, draw a map of Pakistan. So how would you draw a map of Pakistan? You would do this, a little blob here, that's Western, and then here. That doesn't look like a map to me, right? Think of it. How ironic. You would first have to draw the very country that you split up from. There's no other way to do it. And so there were all these proposals, wild proposals. We can't go over each and every one of them, but one of the proposals was, all right, so there are Muslims here, there are Muslims here, there are Muslims here, here, right? And so in fact, one of the suggestions was there should be a kind of a zone here, like let's say a highway, if I may put it this way, which would be Pakistan territory, linking the western part of the country to the eastern part of the country. An absurd proposal, of course, and of course it had not much of a shelf life, needless to say. But this is how the partition of India was effected. Now, a few more details about the partition, and then we really get back to Gandhi, because we're not, as I said, looking at the whole politics of the partition. Anyone's remotely interested in that, I'm doing a course on the partition of India next year, a seminar which is going to be entirely on the partition and the literature and imagination of the partition. Right? So what is going on here? What are some of the considerations we have to think about? The biggest one is, how was this boundary drawn over here, and how was a boundary drawn over here? Right? I mean, how do you just simply draw a line? And so what they did was they appointed a commission. And this commission was appointed only 5 weeks before the two countries became split. Before India was split, and a new country called Pakistan was born, in addition to India being born as a nation state now. It had been there, but now it was a nation state of a certain kind. 5 weeks. I mean, this is the kind of task that usually takes years. How do you draw a line through a village where you've got Hindus and Muslims, and then suddenly you find that, hey, you've been living in this village, but the line has been drawn through it, so now you're no longer in India, you're now in Pakistan. Right? So it was a committee, it's called the Radcliffe Commission. Radcliffe Commission, and as in the case of the Hunter Commission, you might remember, in 1919, or the Rowlett Commission, the commission is usually named after the chairman of the commission. So this is a man called Sir Cyril Radcliffe. He heads a commission of 9, 4 Hindus, 4 Muslims, and the chair. Now, the chair of this commission was a man who had never been to India. He had never stepped foot on Indian soil. And he has now been charged with adjudicating the destiny of 300 million people. And one of the rationales for having him, this is what is called Orientalism and colonialism at work. One of the rationales, the main rationale for having him, because some people said, why are you getting an Englishman or a Britisher, more broadly speaking, right? Because he was Scottish. Right? Why are you getting somebody from Great Britain who doesn't even know this country that he's supposed to partition? And so the argument that was given was, why not get an Englishman who's been in India? Because the British had been ruling India. There were British officials who had 4 decades of experience in administering India. And just listen to this rationale. It's amazing, right, how the British were thinking. The argument was that in India, there is no such thing as honesty. Okay? Now, if you have an Englishman with 4 decades of experience, the Hindus are going to be shouting in his ear, in his left ear, and saying, oh, because you know how you draw the line makes all the difference. How small or how large is Pakistan going to be? That they're going to be filling his ear with nonsense. The Muslims are going to be filling his other ear with nonsense. And an Englishman in India may be honest. The problem is the natives will corrupt him. The natives will corrupt him. Therefore, you have to get someone who is absolutely incorruptible, even if he's an absolute fool or completely ignorant. And I'm not going to hazard the speculation that he was a fool. I don't know enough about him. I know something about him. But he was certainly ignorant. If you read his diary, his Delhi diary, so he spent 4 weeks in India total, right? Most of the diary is about how rotten India is. Oh, the heat and the dust and the mosquitoes have just taken the life out of him, and he's got what's called Delhi belly. Delhi belly means diarrhea, right? You're constantly running to the loo. You know? Half the time he's talking about this. And here he is in charge of, the whole problem of Kashmir, which continues down to the present day, for example, has something to do, obviously, with how the line was drawn. So here you can see, even in this map, disputed territory controlled by India there, okay, that this sort of golden color, whatever it is, with the green lines, and then the green portion with the yellow lines, that's a portion controlled by Pakistan. Not to mention the fact that you have one portion of the country, right, which is separated by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory. If you're speaking about a lunatic idea in politics, this is it, right? But it was carried out. And this two-nation theory, as it's called, what is the two-nation theory? The two-nation theory is the Hindus constitute a nation unto themselves, the Muslims constitute a nation unto themselves. They're not just 2 separate religions, they're 2 separate nations. And therefore, each of these nations should have its own nation state. That was a two-nation theory which dictated the partition. That India would be a country predominantly now for Hindus, right? And Pakistan would be a country predominantly for Muslims. Of course, this two-nation theory is in a way demolished repeatedly, but it's demolished never more effectively than in December 1971, when East Pakistan, so this was what was known as East Pakistan, although it's ruled from there, from West Pakistan, East Pakistan eventually broke away and became a separate country. I hope you know what it's called, right? Bangladesh, right? That's Bangladesh, right? It became a separate country with a population of over 100 million. And again, I have to give all of this to you in an extraordinarily truncated form, but that's what you have to think about what the partition of India meant. Now, let me give you a side of the story which is the horrific side. I mean, this is horrific, but now palpably horrific. The partition resulted in the displacement of an estimated 15 million people in the space of less than 1 year, much less than 1 year, the vast bulk of it. It's the largest known displacement in history of a group of people over such a short period of time. In Syria, for example, it is now estimated that there are over 5 million Syrians who are living outside Syria as refugees. This is in the course of 4 years of civil war. We're talking about 15 million people, okay, in less than 1 year. Yes, Christopher?
So did they, like, the people who are displaced at this time, were they, like, so there's two governments now, right?
Yeah, there are two governments, yes.
Okay, but so, like, did the governments, like, give them, like, benefits or something like that?
No. There were no benefits. No. Hardly any. I mean, look, that will get us into the history of the rehabilitation of refugees, all of that. It's an important question, but it's a subject that takes us far away from what we are interested in for the moment. Yes?
How compulsory was it for Muslims to leave India?
Sorry, can you repeat that question again?
How compulsory was it for Muslims, like, to leave India? Because, like, a lot of them stayed.
Yeah. Okay. So, again, complicated question. And the reason it's complicated is that many of those who argued for the partition, okay, many of the Muslims who argued for the partition actually didn't leave. The reason they didn't is the ones who argued, the ones who made the ideological argument for partition, they were the elites. And they knew what would be the repercussions of going. You displace yourself completely, right? That's one part of the story. Then there's a question of, let's say, coercion. Okay? And this is where now we turn to the next slide. And here's the next slide over here. Okay? So if you look at this map over here, the partition of India 1947. And this, you have to study it at some length. It'll be among the slides that I will put up for you at the end of class. All right? So if you look at this, so the blue arrows, Muslim refugees, so these are Muslims, so the line has been drawn. Now they're Muslims who have been left behind. They were Muslims who were already there now. The line has been. But what about the Muslims who get left behind? So these blue arrows show the Muslims who moved to Pakistan from India. The pink arrows show the Hindus who moved from what became Pakistan to India. And the same thing is happening on this side over here, right? So they give you approximate numbers, 3.3 million, 1 million, 5.9 million, 4.1, 1.2. If you add that up, by the way, this is even more than 15, more like 17 million over here. All right? Now, we don't really know the exact numbers, but we have a rough idea somewhere in that vicinity. About 100,000 people are killed. Sorry, 1 million people are killed. 1 million people are killed. But I want to make certain you understand something. This is not, there are people who are studying this as genocide. I have a serious difference of opinion with that school of thought. Not everybody studied it as genocide. Because this is not a genocide. A genocide, as it is conventionally understood, and there are merits in some of that conventional understanding. Of course, our notion of genocide has become more expansive in many ways. But a genocide is perpetrated usually, in the vast majority of cases, by one dominant group against another. Very often, it is backed up by the state, such as the genocide of the Jews. Right? Committed against one group of people by the state. The Nazi party is the state. Right? Or take the example of Rwanda. Now, in the case of the American Indians, it's not a state, but it's a de facto state. Right, where the colonies, we're talking about one dominant group. That's why we need that definition too. One dominant group, white people committing a genocide against the indigenous population of the United States. Something similar happened, of course, in Australia. Right? So forth and so on. One could give numerous other illustrations of that. But in all of these cases, you will see. Here what we have is we have killings on both sides. The state is not taking any part. This was done in the heat of the moment. There were passions. Because what happens? Take a simple illustration. You're a Hindu. You're right across, the line is drawn. Now suddenly you find that you're over here in Pakistan. You're worried about your life. There are Muslims coming from India and vice versa. Muslims coming from India who have been displaced. They might have to leave behind property. They might have to leave behind 5 acres of farmland. They go, what do? They take possession of the land that has now been vacated on the other side, or they try to push that person out. Everybody's angry. Much of the killing was of that kind. Much of that killing. Not all of it, but the vast majority. There is no evidence to suggest that the state on either side, now we're talking about 2 states, Pakistan and India, that on either side that they were in fact culpable for this violence. There are all other interesting aspects. The last thing I want to mention to you before we move back to Gandhi, because we have been interested, and I'm certainly interested both as an activist, as a scholar, and as an intellectual. I'm seriously interested in the question of gender here. Because one of the things that happened was, of course, that in all of these situations, and that's true down to the present day, women become particularly vulnerable. Whenever you have dislocations of this kind, when you have war or other incidents of that kind, women become particularly vulnerable. So it is undoubtedly the case that there were a substantial number of women who were probably raped. Now, here's the institutional side of that story. Quite an extraordinary thing. And again, in a capsule form, very capsule form. Both of the governments set up an organization that worked together in tandem. There was actually an agreement between the new states of Pakistan and India to set up a commission for the recovery of abducted women. That's what it was called. Commission for the Recovery of Abducted Women. What does that mean? Very simply, it means the following. You're a Hindu woman, all right, or a Muslim woman, as the case might be. So let's say you're a Muslim woman. Now you've been left behind in India. The Hindus, some Hindu man sees that, hey, you're vulnerable. The rest of your family has been killed. There were these killings. So you're the only sole survivor, right? What do? You forcibly abduct her, meaning that you basically just take her into your possession, right? And in some cases, there was forcible conversion. Now what happens? That 5 years down the road, these countries say, hey, these women, the Indian government is saying, are Hindu women. There's some of them still in Pakistan. They need to come back to India. And Pakistan government is saying, they're Muslim women in India now who really ought to be coming back to Pakistan. I have to tell you, by the way, just so that you understand, that it is far from being the case, going back to a question there earlier, that all the Muslims left. Not at all. A substantial number of Muslims stayed behind, and in fact, India has the second largest Muslim population in the world today, after Indonesia. Just a little bit over the total number of Muslims in Pakistan. They're actually, or at least the same number of Muslims in India as they are in Pakistan, even today. Whereas in Pakistan, there are very, very few Hindus today. The percentage of Hindus in Pakistan today is less than 1.5%, closer to 1%. So Pakistan really did become effectively, in that sense, a single religion state. In India, the Hindus constitute today about 79% of the population. Muslims constitute about 14-15% of the population. Then you've got Sikhs, you've got Christians, Buddhists, so forth and so on. Right? So the situation was not parallel at all. However, now in this case of this commission, what it meant was, so you have a Muslim woman, let's say, and she's now living with a Hindu man. And 5 years later, and she has children with him. 5 years later, there's a knock on her door. The government has come to take her back to her home in Pakistan. Well, what does that mean? And of course, the problem was that when these women were they're forcibly repatriated, because it's a matter of honor for each country. In many of these cases, when she was repatriated back, her biological family would refuse to take her back, her natal family, because they'd say, you're now living with a man of the other religion. You're living in another country. You've been disgraced. You're a disgrace to the family, etc., right? So this was the commit. So you see, the importance of that is precisely the fact that the women were seen as the embodiment of the nation, the embodiment of culture, right? They are invested with the idea that they are the repositories of what is good and eternal in each culture and each nation, right? And that might tell you might give you a hint as to why nations are possessive about their women too, not just individual men, all right? So it's an interesting set of considerations. Now, let me go back to Gandhi. So where is Gandhi in all of this? Where Gandhi is in all of this is that in 1945, 46, when the negotiations are taking place, of course, Gandhi is part of the negotiations. But you must remember something I've insisted repeatedly in this class, that Gandhi actually occupied no formal office, right? No formal office. And in fact, Gandhi had made it long clear for 2 decades and made it clear that if there was going to be an independent India, and if he was still alive at that point in time, that he would occupy no office. And he's, frankly, if I may put it this way, let's take it the hagiographic way, put a halo around him in that sense for a moment. He's much too big at this point to be occupying an office, even if it be the office of the president or the prime minister. It's a kind of thing, Gandhi never won the Nobel Prize for Peace, by the way, right? So I know scores of Indians who keep on getting agitated, say, hey, King won the prize, and King says that his greatest teacher was Gandhi. The Dalai Lama won the prize, and Dalai Lama says Gandhi was my teacher. How come the teacher never got the award, the greatest man of the 20th century, and everyone else got it? Gandhi is too big for some Nobel Prize, how does it really matter, whether he got the Nobel Prize or not? We have to be, in India, the middle class has to learn to be much less anxious about these stupid little things, like the Nobel Prize, considering that there are war criminals who have also gotten the Nobel Prize, such as one former Secretary of State of the United States by the name of Henry Kissinger. He won the Nobel Prize too, for peace. We don't really want to have Gandhi linked with him, frankly, if you ask me. All right? So now Gandhi is not going to occupy any office, that's clear, but he's part of the negotiations. The gist of the matter is that Gandhi is not really able to influence, at this point, the course of events. I think we have to be absolutely candid about that. And there are people who expected too much of him. For example, it has been argued by many people that Gandhi would go on a fast unto death. So when the partition was going to become a reality, why didn't Gandhi go on a fast unto death and say, hey, if there's going to be a partition, I'm just fasting and I'm going to let myself die? Because then you would have to ask the question, who would he be fasting against? Who is he fasting to influence? In every fast that he undertook, there is a specific community that he's fasting to influence. So who is he going to try to influence? The Hindus, the Muslims, the elites, the workers. Everyone is invested in this question in a certain way. Gandhi also understood, point number 2, the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground was that the events had moved past him. And point number 3, he understood that his was a voice in the wilderness. By which I mean that even though he exercised a moral authority of a kind that was unprecedented in modern history, in India at least, that at this point in time he did not have the opinion that matter behind him, to be able to say, we are going to resist this to the last. That events had really outstripped him, and that this was now going to become unstoppable, this demand for a country called Pakistan. So what I'm doing here is I'm synthesizing, hundreds of thousands of pages that people have written on these matters and speculations and so forth and so on. But the crux of the matter is that Gandhi, even though he's part of the negotiations, in some ways he's going to be marginalized. And I want you to think about it, because we are, after all, interested in the making of modern India, because this will lead to the question which we're going to address head on later on. What is his relationship to this entity called India today? To what extent did he leave behind some kind of legacy or not? Or was his legacy more overseas, for example? Right? If we want to use the word legacy, so forth and so on. However, what interests us most, because it's one way in which we get into this, is what happens in the immediate aftermath of the partition. When the partition took place and the assassination of Gandhi, when the partition took place, August 14th, 1947, Pakistan is created. August 15th, India becomes a nation state now, right? Gandhi was to be seen nowhere in Delhi. Delhi is where the celebrations were. This is where the official handover of power took place. What is called by the British the transfer of power. That is, by the way, the name of this huge series. It's that big, published by the British government. All right, I mean it's 2 feet wide. The series is called the Transfer of Power. All the official documents, the negotiations. Transfer suggests something very orderly, right? It's like the transfer of power from Barack Obama to whoever the next president of the United States would be, right, in Washington, D.C. in January, right? That's a transfer of power. It's constitutional, so forth and so on. Of course, this was constitutional too in India, but there were people who were being killed. And the refugees were pouring into Delhi. This is the city I was born in and I grew up in. Delhi before 1947, 1941 census, Delhi had a population of 400,000. 400,000. Today it has a population of 22 million. The second largest city in the world after Tokyo. Right? And this influx of people, refugees coming in, it created a completely different city in time. A separate history unto itself. All right? So now, Gandhi is not there. Because he said this was... You see, you'll have to understand what's happening here. It's a good way for me to get into the politics of the assassination and the questions that really are most germane for us now, as we move into the last week. If we think of Gandhi, one of the predominant idioms in which we think of him is as someone who is the architect of independence. The principal architect. Well, right, if you're a critic, you'll say one of the architects, and if you're a severe critic, you'll say, well, his role has been overstated. But let's take the view that has predominated for a long time, whatever one's personal view of Gandhi or the animus that one may or may not have against him. It's widely understood that he's the major political figure in India for 2-3 decades now. Right? And now, finally, he's been leading all these campaigns. Finally, the British are being evicted. I prefer the word evicted. Transfer of power is too sanitized. The British were evicted. Right? So the British are being evicted now. The house is coming back to order, one hopes. Right? Because here you have people who've not been paying rent for 200 years. The British, who are now being evicted. That's what you do to people who don't pay rent. I don't think that should be done necessarily with individuals, but certainly when you have rogue nations, that's what you do. You evict them. Right? So here's the irony. The British are being evicted. Gandhi is the person who is creating the nation state. And when the nation state is born, Gandhi says, this is the most tragic moment of my life. He says that. This is the most tragic moment of my life. It saddens me beyond belief. And he is in Calcutta, in eastern India. He is in Calcutta at the other end of the country, where he is trying to quell the violence, where he is trying to pour water on the flames of communal violence that have been engulfing the country. And when I say the other end, here is Calcutta. Look at this. Here's Calcutta. This is Delhi. This is where the parliament building was. This is where the transfer of power was taking place, where Nehru makes this famous speech, when the rest of the world is asleep, at midnight, India awakens to freedom. India's tryst with destiny. A very famous speech that he gives, right? Resonates. And Gandhi is not there. Because he is now bothered, immensely agitated by the violence that is taking place over here, the Hindu-Muslim violence that is taking place, and he's trying to control it. And this is, some people argue, even those who've been hostile to him argue that this may have been the most supreme moment of his life. Lord Mountbatten was a viceroy of India, so he's the last viceroy of India. He's the one who's been administering India and on behalf of the British, and he's the one who's been sitting with the Indian leaders negotiating. And Mountbatten said that what a force of 50,000 soldiers could not do, Gandhi was a one-man boundary force who was basically able to bring peace to this area. That's a long story. What Gandhi was doing there, how did he effect this peace, so forth and so on. Right? So what is the irony we're playing upon? The irony we're playing upon is the man who is, in a way, responsible for the nation state, the Indian nation state, is the man who is least committed to the idea of the nation state. I want to explain what I mean by that. And the principal reading you have for next week is chapters from my book, because my whole book is basically an exploration of this tension. All right? So let's try to understand what is happening here. Not in strictly political terms. We have to think in extra-political and political in the larger sense, and we have to think in ethical terms. The fundamental political fact of modernity is this thing called the nation state. We are all citizens of a nation state, whichever nation state that might be, whether it's the United States, Britain, Sudan, India, Pakistan, whatever the case might be. And a nation state has ways of marking itself. The first way it marks itself is it draws boundaries, or others draw boundaries for it. Right? We can look at geopolitically. We could look at the complexities of how nation states are drawn. But each nation state has a boundary. There are some cases where these boundaries are contested, and that's why countries are at war sometimes, when these boundaries are contested. Right? But that's what a nation state is. It's a space marked by boundaries, and then you enforce these boundaries. Historically speaking, it's not the case that these boundaries were enforced. The United States was not a nation state in 1600, or 1700. The pilgrims who came in, the immigrants who came in, you think they were asked to produce something called what? Passport. Has a passport existed from eternity? It has not. There's a book called The Social History of the Passport. There are 2-3 interesting books on the passport. When was a passport invented? How did people travel before? All these Gujarati merchants who wandered all around the world, they weren't carrying a passport. Right? This is a very modern way of thinking about the world. Things that we completely have naturalized, assume that they've always been there. And what does a passport do? It's one way of enforcing the border. You enforce a border by having guards, by security, immigration officials, and you enforce it by having passports. If you don't produce a passport, you can't walk into the US. Well, yeah, you can try from, obviously from Mexico. That's the whole point. But if you're landing at, LAX or O'Hare in Chicago, you need a passport if you're going to be allowed entry into the country. And then each country has a national anthem, a national song, national bird, national animal, national flower, etc., etc. Right? Why do countries have these things? Why do nation states have these things? They have them partly because they wish to produce loyalty. They wish to produce homogeneity among their subjects. Right? So when the Star-Spangled Banner, whatever, is sung, you're all supposed to, put your hand on your heart or whatever it is that you do, right? And, your heart is supposed to swell with pride. Why do they do it at every football game, every basketball game? I mean, these are things that are worthwhile asking, right? Because in a way, it's frankly very childish. And why should you have to pay your allegiance to something called a nation state? I mean, a ridiculous, absurd idea in some ways. Why should you have to pay? What if a nation state is murdering other people? Should you be loyal to the nation state? Right? Yeah, I'm putting it in this rhetorical, exaggerated form as well for you, although I personally do adhere to the views that I'm expressing here. I find the nation state to be a real problem for humanity, that we're going to have to find some other way of organizing ourselves into political communities. Because nation states have a relationship to this darn thing called nationalism. Nationalism, right? So now, what is the irony we're playing upon? Here's this Gandhi, who has been one of the major figures in the freedom struggle. Now a nation state is born, not the one that he wanted to be born, because it's now, right, split. But in whatever shape and form, there is a nation state, now called India. But Gandhi found the nation state to be an entity that was fundamentally destructive of the human spirit. He found it to be an entity precisely for the reasons that I've been mentioning to you. It produces a sense of homogeneity. In order to produce a subjects of a nation state, you have to commit violence against them. There has never been any nation state, certainly not the United States, that has come about without producing homogeneity forcibly. Of course, now in such a country which is so hegemonic like the US, now you don't have to do it forcibly anymore. Because now this is what hegemony means. This is now being imbibed as part of the cultural process through which people become Americans, right? So you all start shopping at Walmart and, doing this and that, eating at McDonald's, you become Americans. That produces homogeneity, Yes, you can have a little twist on it, so, 10% can go to Whole Foods, right? The elite, right? So forth and so on. But yeah, these are all ways of producing homogeneity. And of course, the fundamental way is a textbook. Every country has textbooks. Why do you think people fight over textbooks? Because a textbook offers you the authorized version of that nation state's history. This is the authorized official version. And that's one reason I don't use textbooks, ever. Not even in introductory classes. Because they produce a certain homogeneous field of knowledge. All right? Now, then, Gandhi is someone who is looking at India as an entity that is a civilization. As a civilization, it's been around for 4,500 years or 4,000 years. As a nation state, it is one of the youngest ones. Right? And his contention tacitly was, and we'll have to read this through the assassination now, because his assassin was not a madman. Unlike what Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, said. And of course I understand the spirit in which he said it, right? But a madman, there are multiple meanings. He's a madman because anyone who kills someone like Gandhi is mad in a certain sense of the term. But if mad means irrational, which it also means, no, his assassin was not irrational. The problem was the reverse. He was hyper-rational. And I'm going to try to explain that. Right? But in order to understand that, you have to understand that Gandhi is thinking that, look, India is a civilization. It has been able to accommodate differences. There have been Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Parsis, Buddhists living here, right? there's more linguistic diversity than there is in any other part of the world by far. By far, you know. Right? I mean, even the Indian banknote, if I, you know, brought a banknote before you, even the Indian banknote lists each denomination in 15 languages. And those are just the constitutional languages which have speakers of 50 million or more. You know, there are 1,000 languages, right? Now, this is a civilization. A civilization learns to accommodate differences. No one is saying, I'm not saying, that a civilization is, everything is hunky-dory. You know, that everyone's living peacefully. No, there will always be differences. There are class divides. There are people with vested interests. There are people who are promoting one religion over another. But a civilization learns to accommodate differences. A nation state cannot do that. That was at least the fundamental thinking here in Gandhi's own ideas about what was really going on here. That how have we as a people come to this, right, to this pass, to this point, where even though Muslims have been living here for 1,200 years, now, along with Hindus, now they're saying, hey, we want a separate country for ourselves, because we cannot live in, quote, Hindu India. How did we come to this pass? This never happened in 1400 and 1500 and 1300, right? And now supposedly we're more progressive. We learn to live with each other. Well, we're not learning to live with each other. If I look around me at all the genocides that are taking place, I mean, just look at what's happening in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, right? This is the question here that I think is central to trying to understand what is happening in the assassination. So now, moving to the assassination, let's first talk a little bit about the assassin. First thing I have to tell you is that this was not the only assassination attempt on Gandhi's life. This is the one we know about because it was a successful one. He killed the man, right? But there had been several other assassination attempts on Gandhi before. And it is not an accident that all of these previous assassination attempts were by upper caste Brahmins. Upper caste Brahmins. So people who belong, and not just upper caste Brahmins, the majority of them were from one Brahmin community in particular, right? One Brahmin community in particular, many of them, Chitpavan Brahmins. And if you've read the Nandi piece, if you haven't, read it, because you definitely, okay, I'm giving you more than, this is not a subtle hint, you're going to get something related to the assassination. This is a very, very important piece, all right? The final encounter. So these are upper caste Brahmins, and they're all from Western India, right? They're all from this area, here, around Pune. Several assassination attempts made before, none of them succeeded. Finally, the one that succeeds, Nathuram Godse, comes from Pune. So what is Nandi arguing? All right? Before we get back to the geopolitics of the assassination, let's look a little bit about who the assassin is and what is really going on. And so he comes from this upper caste community. This community of Chitpavan Brahmins, the assassin's name is Godse, Nathuram Godse. Nandi has a psychoanalytic interpretation as well, which you are free to reject. It adds quite a bit to it, but I would argue that it's not essential to the argument. The psychoanalytic argument is that Godse was born in a family, his mother, his birth mother, had been pregnant several times before she finally bore Nathuram, and that in each of those cases, the child died either in the womb or, shortly after birth, whatever, right? I don't remember the details. And so when she became pregnant again for the fourth time, she and her husband, Nathuram's father, while she was still pregnant, they went to this holy man, a fakir, and said, look, we've got this problem. And he said, well, the evil eye has cast a spell on you. We don't need to get into all the details. What you need to do in order to ward off this evil spirit is if a boy is born to you, bring him up as a girl, because this confuses the evil spirit. All right? Bring him up as a girl. And so Nathuram, Nath is the nose. A boy is born. He's going to be brought up as a girl. Among other things, they put a nose ring. Some girls, they put a nose ring. Okay, so that Nath is nose. Okay, now he's brought up as a girl, and the argument here is that that as he grows up and grows out of adolescence into manhood, he becomes extremely anxious about his identity and wants to compensate for the femininity that had been imposed upon him by becoming hypermasculine. Okay? That's the psychoanalytic portion of it. But as I said, and of course you can now begin to see that if this were the case, if you accepted the psychoanalytic reading, you would begin to see that this hyper-masculinity of Godse is going to especially prey upon what he thought was the hyper-femininity of Gandhi. Right? There's this old effeminate man, non-violence. Non-violence is for women. It's not for men. Right? Men should be going out doing things. Right? This is how Godse is thinking. And I don't care whether you accept the psychoanalytic reading or not, but there's no question that there is a kind of an exaggerated masculinity in all of what he projects about himself. And he says in his speech, so when Nathuram shot Gandhi at point blank range, he just comes up to him and 3 revolver shots. Right? Another long story that you read the chapter, one of my chapters there, Gandhi had no security, did not believe in security at all. Right? So that's a separate issue for a moment. He shoots him, and then he's put on trial for the assassination, and he issues his long statement, reads out this statement for hours and hours in court. The Indian government banned it right away because, of course, he had shot Gandhi, who was the father of the nation. Right? And they thought that Godse had said all of these ridiculous things, and they were worried how the Indian people would react to it. So they banned that statement. It was only made public about 20 years after the death of the assassin. So the assassin is convicted, he's executed eventually. Again, another long, interesting story in itself, because Gandhi was completely opposed to capital punishment. And I think the first thing he would have said is that my own assassin should never be given the death sentence, under any circumstances. Right? So you see, each one of those things is a story unto itself that we can build upon. The main thing here is that the assassin issues a statement in his defense and says, I had to shoot this man. I had to shoot him because he's effeminate. He is soft. He is womanly. He is weak. We cannot have someone like him leading a nation. Do you know what the world is like? The world is like a den of wolves. India is going to be eaten up alive when you have someone like Gandhi still exercising moral influence over the country. Does he understand that there are countries such as Pakistan who are out to get India? This is effectively what he's saying. You cannot have a nation state led by a weakling. You notice whose language this is today? I hope you do. I mean, this Trump and Godse, you could replace the speeches with each other. That's his constant thing. Oh, look at these, they're weaklings. All his opponents, they're weaklings. It's interesting, you see. And of course, he trumps himself as a masculine candidate in every sense of the term. That's, you think about what is going on here in this speech. Right? So now, let's go back. Keep that in mind. Let's put it, using Nandi's language, let's put it in an analytical fashion. 1. What Gandhi did was, because he's trying to understand what the meaning of Gandhi is for Indian politics, what Gandhi did was he changed the relationship of the center and the periphery. The periphery. Periphery is those who are marginalized. They're marginalized either because they're poor, because they're lower caste, or they're women, or there are certain kinds of tribal groups, etc., etc. There are various ways in which one is marginalized. Correct? So Nandi's argument is that Gandhi effected a fundamental alteration in the Indian political social order. That people such as Nathuram, who belongs to the Chit Pavan Brahmin community, one of the highest Brahmin orders, these people suddenly found themselves in an India where Gandhi had been at the helm of power for 25 years. They found that they had been pushed to the margins. And those people who had always been disenfranchised suddenly found themselves with power. Women, Dalits. Of course, all of this is contested. But even if you said that that's too rosy a picture, there's no question that this was a mass movement he led. And lots of people who were involved in it, in the mass movements that Gandhi led, were working class people, peasants, industrial workers, women. You look at the people around him, how many of these were upper caste Brahmins? Remember all the friends and associates and disciples he had, right? He's saying that this was something that filled Nathuram with anxiety. He did not want to see an India where people like him and his community would no longer be ruling the roost. And this is what filled him with rage against Mahatma Gandhi. The conventional explanation always was what? The conventional explanation was Gandhi was a Muslim lover, and therefore Nathuram killed him. That's a conventional reading. The one that was always circulated, right? The one that still predominates. Many of the Hindu right wing, by the way, still support Nathuram Godse. There is a movement in India to build statues of Nathuram Godse and install them in different parts of the country. Statues of the assassin, right? Because these Hindu right-wing people say that, yeah, Nathuram Godse did the right thing, and we should salute him as a martyr to the nation. We should salute him as a martyr to the nation. There are many people in the present government of India occupying some of the highest offices who support that point of view. Right? So the implications were that Gandhi is now altering the entire social order. And Nathuram understands that. He's not mad. If mad means being irrational, he has thought through this. He wants a kind of an instrumental rationality. You know, there are many kinds of rationality. There's rationality where one is obviously, right, using the process of reasoning to arrive at a conclusion about a certain thing or to derive an argument. There is a rationality which serves only something called self-interest, where you instrumentalize the rationality. So, one, this assassination is about the fundamental reordering of India that was taking place or would take place under Gandhi, and the assassins attempt to immediately halt that by eliminating Gandhi from the picture. Secondly, this assassination has to be understood also as an illustration of the pathology, illness, disease of rationality. It is the pathology of rationality that is at stake here. We always think of irrationality as a form of pathology. That's why people who with psychosis and neuroses and schizophrenia are treated. These are pathologies of irrationality. I think we should be much more attentive to those who are hyper-rational, such as some of those who are running for office. Their pathology needs to be treated seriously. And that's what this assassination is secondly about. And thirdly, it is about the fundamental relationship between masculinity and this thing called the nation state. The nation state. There is no such thing as a soft nation state. When there is, those who run that state are embarrassed by it. They want to produce a nation state that is strong and muscular. You know? Kissinger always used to say, going back to Kissinger, right, that one of the reasons why China became a nuclear power, because why do countries want to become nuclear powers? Right? And of course you can say, you know, if that's what they do in political science, mumbo jumbo. They'll come up with all these accounts of, yeah, you know, deterrence, this and that. But political scientists don't think in cultural categories. They don't understand the relationship between these things and such things as masculinity, for example. They'll have deterrence, oh, you know, you need it, that's why North Korea, or, you know, makes these rhetorical gestures, so forth and so on. Right? What did Kissinger say? He said the only way China could be heard internationally was if it became a nuclear power, which it did. People are going to start taking it seriously. A friend of mine who teaches here, he has the most wonderful description for India, you know. He called it the largest, most unimportant country in the world. Okay? Here's a country of 1.25 billion, no one pays any attention to it at all, which was true for a long time. And that was one reason why India wanted to become a nuclear power. Suddenly everyone awakens to the fact, hey, there's a place called India, and yeah, there are 500 million people living in poverty, but they also are a nuclear state. We better be a little careful about it. Here's the cultural politics of sexuality, the cultural politics of nuclearism is what we have to think about when we are looking at such things. This is all at stake in the assassination. It's all at stake. But the immediate pretext was Gandhi is a friend of the Muslims. As I have argued in a number of my pieces, there are many in India who say that he should rightfully be called not the father of India, but the father of Pakistan. He really belongs there. I mean, if you wanted to really slight the man, that's what you do. You say he's really the father of Pakistan. He authored that idea because if it hadn't been for Gandhi, you know, the Muslims would have been put in their place. And they would never have been allowed to have come to that stage in 1947 where they said, we want a Pakistan and it's going to be conceded. I've heard this argument endless number of times. You can read it in Indian newspapers all the times. That if Gandhi hadn't been around, the Muslims would never have dared to gone as far as they did in India. Right? Okay? I'd love to take questions, but I need to really just, you know, if that's what seminars are for. So, you know, take a seminar sometime. You know, it's all discussion. Let me just finish with this trajectory. All right? Now, there was another catalyst. And I want to mention that. Because, again, it gives you a sense of how to evaluate Gandhi. So, when the partition took place, you also had to partition all the resources of the country, right? A new nation state's been created. Well, what is it going to run on? It's not going to run on grass. It needs revenues, right? To whom does things belong? And, you know, we have accounts in some villages in a school. If there were 20 pencils, you know, okay, 8 of them will be given to India, 12 of them will be given to Pakistan. You know, all the chairs and desks, you know, so many go to India, so many go to Pakistan. If that village, if the line was drawn in the village. But we're talking about resources at the mega level now, at the mega level. So India had agreed to pay the sum of 550 million rupees to Pakistan. Okay? However, this money was withheld by the government of India because, to cut a very, very long story short, because that story continues down to the present day, a dispute arose over Kashmir. Kashmir, which you saw in a previous slide over here, right? Disputed territory, Jammu and Kashmir. A state predominantly Muslim in population, run by a Hindu king. You can begin to see how things are going to get complicated. A dispute arose over Kashmir because eventually the ruler of Kashmir, after much hesitation, and there's a long narrative there, eventually signs a treaty of accession to India. Pakistan disputed the legality of that accession. It's called the accession, right? Where you sign a treaty saying, I get absorbed, I agree to relinquish my kingdom. The kingdom becomes absorbed into India. Pakistan disputed that. The dispute continues down to the present day. Now, the Indian government's view was, and a war broke out. That was the first war that broke out between India and Pakistan. There have been a number of wars since then. A war broke out between India and Pakistan over this issue, and the Indian government's view was, we're not going to pay Pakistan the money because it's actually going to use the money to buy arms to hit us. Gandhi disputed that. He said, a promise is a promise. This is what is owed to Pakistan. If they use that money to bomb us into extinction, that's what they do. You have to live by your obligation. This money belongs to Pakistan. It doesn't belong to us. However, and he goes on a fast. It's the last fast. Just 2 weeks short of his assassination. But the fast had really nothing to do with this. Although that's what everybody assumed, it had to do with the fact that Delhi was engulfed by communal violence. And the fact that the capital of India, of New India now, was itself engulfed by violence was, of course, something that everybody had to think about. Right? So he goes on a fast. Eventually the fast is broken. It's a fast unto death. The fast is broken after 4 days. Godse heard the news. He had decided this is why Gandhi is going on a fast, because this is where Gandhi becomes known as a friend of Pakistan, friend of Muslims. That, hey, India is at war with Pakistan and he wants the Indian government to hand over the money to Pakistan. Right? So they can send more jets against us. This is how Godse was thinking. And this is what I mean. You see, here you also have, in the case of Gandhi, a man who's willing to put principles above the idea that you just simply follow the nation state. It is an extraordinary set of events, but as I said, that's the immediate catalyst, but there have been many attempts before. And this whole thing had been brewing in Godse's mind for a long time. We know that. In fact, just before his assassination, Gandhi was also, there was an attempt just 10 days before his assassination as well. So, 30th January 1948, in the evening, Gandhi is going to be shot dead. He dies on the spot, and there is an art of dying as well. If Gandhi had died of whooping cough, right, or TB, or he had been hit by a car, it would not have been a death befitting a Mahatma. A Mahatma can only be assassinated after all. You have to think of it this way. He had been thinking, by the way, about his death, just like King had been. I've been to the mountaintop speech. I mean, he says there very clearly, I may not be here any longer. It's almost as though, I don't want to sort of say, they prophesize their death. If there's an art of living, there's also an art of dying. And we'd have to understand how, in a sense, Gandhi had been cultivating that art as well. Because living and dying have an organic relationship with each other. You see, we have to understand that. That's one of the problems with modern medicine. Modern medicine sees them as antagonistic. The whole so-called war against cancer, right, on which trillions and trillions of dollars have been expended, is all based on this postulate that these are opposites. They are complementary. They are complementary. Okay? So, Gandhi is assassinated, and we don't need this slide anymore here. Gandhi is assassinated, and one of the effects of his assassination is that he is going to, through his death, bring a complete halt to the violence. the entire communal violence in India dies down immediately after his death. You know? And in Pakistan as well. And it's as though in dying he had now actually given birth to the possibility of others living. Right? This is also part of the art of dying as I am describing it for you over here. But there is a piece, I will send it to you, which you don't have to read now, but if you get inspired to read it later on, after your final exam, you can read it. It's a piece that I wrote on Gandhi and the art of dying, where I delve into these matters in some greater detail. So we will, with this, stop for today, and for next week, we look really at Gandhi and the whole question. Now, from the post-47 vantage point down to the present day, we look at Gandhi and the question of modernity, Gandhi and the question of